In the fast-paced rhythm of modern life, many of us quietly wonder, who am I, really? What is the truest essence of myself? On the surface, these questions seem simple, yet within them lies a profound journey of self-discovery, where the boundary between the ego and the true self is often blurred by layers of ambition, fear, comparison, and societal expectations. The ego is like a mask we wear throughout our lives, shaped by memories, beliefs, wounds, and the constant desire for control. It is that restless voice in the mind that urges us to compete, to prove ourselves, to defend, and to protect. The ego convinces us that our worth is defined by recognition, possessions, or appearances. And yet, the more we chase after it, the deeper we fall into cycles of anxiety, comparison, and discontent. In contrast, the true self is quiet, steady, and deeply rooted, like an underground spring flowing silently within. It is pure, untouched by success or failure, gain or loss, praise or criticism. When we come into contact with the true self, we experience a natural sense of peace even amidst life's storms. From this place arises compassion, wisdom, openness, and a genuine connection to all that is. This video on the Dharma journey is not meant to define these concepts in abstract theories or rigid terms. Instead, it is a gentle invitation for you to pause, breathe, and listen deeply within. By learning to see the difference between ego and true self, you begin to understand the roots of your suffering, the weight of your exhaustion, and at the same time, discover the path back to inner freedom. Along the way, you may realize that the ego is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a part of the mind that longs to be seen with clarity. Through mindfulness and awareness, you no longer need to be controlled by it. You can simply observe it, the way one might watch clouds drifting across the sky. In that very space of awareness, the light of the true self begins to shine more clearly, opening a fresh perspective on who you are and what life truly means. On this journey with the Dharma journey, we will walk together into the depth of our inner world, to discern what belongs only to the ego's mask, and what is the timeless essence of the soul. This is not just spiritual philosophy, but a living experience that can transform each moment of daily life. Whether you are sitting quietly in meditation, facing challenges, or simply exchanging a smile with a stranger on the street, let this reflection be the mirror in which you begin to see yourself more clearly. Let it remind you that you are more than the restless voice of the ego. You are the stillness, the compassion, the wisdom, and the freedom that have always been present within you. And perhaps, in recognizing this difference, you will begin to walk life's journey with a lighter heart, a clearer mind, and a deeper sense of belonging. Opening story: the mask we wear. There was once a man everyone admired. On the outside, he looked like the perfect definition of success. He had a stable, high-paying job, sat in important meetings, and carried himself with confidence. He drove a luxury car, lived in a modern apartment, and dined in expensive restaurants. To the world, he was living the dream. But when night came, and he was alone in his spacious apartment, a strange emptiness would creep in. Behind the polished suit and the confident smile, there was a deep exhaustion no one else could see. He would take off his watch, loosen his tie, stare at his reflection in the mirror, and whisper to himself, "Is this really me? Am I living from my ego or from my true self?" That one question cracked open a wall he had spent years building. A wall made of society's praise, family expectations, and the constant race to keep up appearances. But behind that wall was a part of him long forgotten, his true self. The truth is, many of us live a version of this same story. Maybe you're not a CEO or a celebrity, but how often do you feel like you're wearing a mask? Every day we put on roles: the confident professional, the strong parent, the perfect friend. We smile when we're tired, pretend to be in control when we feel lost, and project an image the world expects to see. But when we come back home and sit quietly with ourselves, there's often an inner voice asking, "Who am I really?" That mask we wear is the ego. The ego is built out of comparisons, fears, and the need for approval. It pushes us to chase achievements, recognition, and validation. It tells us we must always prove ourselves, or else we're not enough. The ego is loud, restless, and demanding. But our true self is different. The true self is quiet, simple, and free. It doesn't need to prove anything because it already knows it is whole. It doesn't seek to dominate, compete, or impress. It just exists, in peace, in the present moment. This brings us to the essential question. Am I living from my ego or from my true self? It's not just a philosophical question. It's a doorway to transformation. When we pause and reflect, we start to see how much of our daily life is dictated by ego. We work tirelessly, not always because we love what we do, but because we fear being left behind. We chase titles, not always because they fulfill us, but because they give us a sense of worth. And the more we feed the ego, the hungrier it becomes. Think about it. How often do you compare yourself to others on social media? How often do you feel a small surge of pride when someone praises you, or a sting of pain when you feel unnoticed? These are the whispers of the ego, keeping us in a cycle of striving and dissatisfaction.
The man in our story had everything he thought he needed, yet he felt empty. Why? Because success that is built on ego will never satisfy. It will always demand more. But when you live from your true self, even the simplest things, a quiet walk, a heartfelt conversation, a moment of stillness, feel complete. The mask we wear may win us recognition, but it will never give us peace. The true self may be invisible to the world, but it brings us the kind of inner freedom nothing else can replace. So maybe the real journey in life isn't about building a bigger ego, but about peeling away the layers of illusion to return to who we already are. And that begins with one simple yet powerful question. Am I living from my ego or from my true self? What is the ego? Before we can understand the difference between ego and the true self, we need to take a closer look at what the ego actually is. In simple terms, the ego is the false self, the identity we construct out of thoughts, fears, comparisons, and desires. It is the voice in our mind that says, I must be better than others, or, what if I lose what I have? It thrives on competition, on being seen, on feeling special. But no matter how much it achieves, it is never satisfied. The ego is like a shadow we mistake for our real being. It convinces us that we are our job, our possessions, our status, or even our opinions. It makes us believe that if we gain enough recognition, wealth, or success, we will finally feel complete. But in truth, the ego can only give us temporary satisfaction, never lasting peace. Buddha once taught that clinging to the self, what he called attachment to the idea of I, is the root of suffering. Why? Because the ego is built on illusion. It wants permanence in a world that is always changing. It wants control in a reality that is uncontrollable. It wants to protect me and mine, even though the very idea of a separate, permanent self does not truly exist. Think about how the ego operates in everyday life. When someone criticizes you, even gently, what happens? Instantly, the ego flares up. How dare they say that? They don't understand me. I need to defend myself. That reaction comes not from your true self, but from the fragile identity your ego is trying to protect. Or consider social media. You post a picture, and when the likes pour in, you feel a rush of pride. But if the response is smaller than expected, you feel disappointed or even invisible. This roller coaster of emotions is the ego at work, constantly measuring your worth based on outside approval. The ego also loves comparison. It's not enough to have a good life. The ego wants to know if your life is better than your neighbors, your coworkers, or even a stranger's on the internet. And when the ego feels inferior, it breeds jealousy, resentment, and a sense of lack. When it feels superior, it breeds arrogance and pride. In both cases, peace is lost. But here is the paradox. The ego is not evil. It's simply a survival mechanism. It developed to help us navigate the world, to create an identity, to feel separate and safe. The problem arises when we confuse the ego with who we really are. Instead of being a useful tool, it becomes our master. And when the ego runs the show, suffering is inevitable. The Buddha's teaching on anatta, or no self, shines a light on this truth. He explained that what we call the self is nothing more than a collection of thoughts, sensations, and perceptions, constantly changing, never fixed. When we cling to this illusion of a solid I, we set ourselves up for disappointment. Because sooner or later things change.
The body ages, possessions are lost, status fades, and when the ego ties our identity to those fragile things, we suffer deeply when they slip away. So, what is the ego? It is the mask, the illusion, the restless I that always wants more and fears losing what it has. It is the endless chase that never leads to true freedom. And yet, recognizing the ego is the first step to awakening. Because once you see that voice for what it is, not your true self, but just a passing shadow, you create space. Space to breathe. Space to step back. Space to discover something deeper, something more real. The ego asks, how do I compare? How do I win? How do I protect myself? The true self asks nothing. It simply is. This is why the Buddha said, clinging to self is the root of suffering. The moment we loosen our grip on the ego, even just a little, we begin to taste freedom. A freedom not based on what we achieve or lose, but on simply being who we are. Beyond masks, beyond illusions, beyond fear. Signs you're living in ego mode. In Buddhism, the Buddha often taught that clinging to the self, what he called attachment to I and mine, is the root of suffering. The ego is simply a modern way of describing this same self-clinging. It is subtle, deceptive, and shows up in the most ordinary moments of our lives. You don't have to be arrogant or boastful to be living in ego mode. In fact, some of the most common behaviors we all experience are quiet signs that the ego is running the show. Here are some clear signals that may sound very familiar. 1. Constantly worrying about what others think of you. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately thought, how do I look? Do they think I'm smart enough? Successful enough? Attractive enough? That anxious voice comes from the ego. Instead of being comfortable in your own presence, you measure your worth through other people's eyes. The Buddha reminded us that praise and blame are like the wind, always changing, never reliable. If your happiness depends on others' opinions, you'll always be tossed around like a leaf in the storm. 2. Needing to win, needing to be right. The ego thrives on argument. Whenever someone disagrees with you, the ego quickly jumps in. I can't let them be right. I have to prove myself. Think about social media debates. How often do we find ourselves fighting over trivial topics, just to come out on top? In Buddhist teaching, this is a form of pride or conceit. The wise person doesn't need to win every argument because truth doesn't require proving. As the Buddha taught, holding tightly to views creates suffering. Letting go brings peace. 3. Feeling jealous of other people's success. When a friend gets promoted, a colleague receives praise, or even a stranger shows off their vacation online. Do you ever feel a sting of envy? That's the ego in disguise. It whispers, what about me? Why don't I have that? But in Buddhism, jealousy is seen as a poison of the mind. The Buddha taught that envy can never bring peace. Instead, he encouraged the practice of mudita, sympathetic joy, the ability to be genuinely happy for others' happiness. When we rejoice in another's good fortune, our heart expands and suffering decreases. 4. The need to control everything. The ego cannot stand uncertainty. It wants life to unfold exactly as planned. When things go differently, frustration and fear rise. But the Buddha taught the law of impermanence. All conditioned things are impermanent, like dreams, illusions, bubbles, or shadows. Life is always changing. The tighter we try to grip, the more we suffer when it inevitably slips away. True freedom comes not from control, but from accepting change as the very nature of life. 5. Struggling to admit mistakes or weakness. The ego always wants to look perfect. When we make mistakes, instead of admitting them, we often justify, hide, or blame others. Why? Because the ego fears that if others see our flaws, our value will diminish. Yet the Buddha compared the mind to a mirror. It must be cleaned with honesty and humility. Mistakes are not the enemy. They are the path to growth. By acknowledging our flaws with compassion, we loosen the ego's grip and make room for wisdom to arise. When you reflect on these signs, it becomes clear that the ego is not just an abstract idea. It's a daily experience. It sneaks into our thoughts, our conversations, our reactions. And when we don't recognize it, the ego quietly shapes our entire life, trapping us in cycles of comparison, competition, and dissatisfaction. The Buddha taught that suffering comes from clinging, and ego is clinging in its most personal form. But here's the key. We don't have to destroy the ego. We only need to see it. Every time you notice yourself worrying about others' opinions, trying to prove you're right, or envying someone's success, that moment of awareness is already a step toward freedom. The path of awakening begins with recognition. When we see the ego for what it is, just a passing shadow, not our true self, we create space to return to something deeper, something quieter, something real. The ego constantly asks, how do I compare? How do I win? How do I protect myself? But the true self asks nothing at all. It simply rests in peace. What is the true self? If the ego is like a mask that constantly seeks approval, comparison, and control, then the true self is the quiet presence that exists underneath it all. It's not something you need to build or achieve. It's something you uncover because it has always been there. In Buddhist teachings, the true self is not about personal identity or the story you tell about who you are. Instead, it points to the essence of your being: stillness, compassion, and innate wisdom. When you touch this deeper reality, you realize that peace doesn't come from chasing after wealth, fame, or recognition. Peace comes from resting in what you already are. Think of it this way. Imagine a clear lake. When the surface is disturbed by wind, waves appear, and the water looks chaotic. That's the ego, restless, easily shaken, always reacting. But beneath the surface, the lake is still and calm. That depth is your true self. No matter how many waves crash above, the depth remains untouched. Your true self is naturally compassionate. When you act from it, you don't need to force kindness or generosity. It flows effortlessly, like sunlight shining through an open window. You don't need others to validate your worth, because you feel whole in yourself. The Buddha often reminded his followers that clinging to the false self, the illusion of I and mine, is the root of suffering. But when we let go of that clinging, what's left is clarity, freedom, and love. This doesn't mean you reject the world, money, or relationships. It simply means you are no longer bound by them. You can enjoy success without being enslaved by it. You can love without fear of losing. You can live fully without being defined by status or comparison. The true self is not about perfection. It's about authenticity, living in harmony with your deepest values, and recognizing your shared humanity with all beings. It's the space inside you that knows, I am enough, and I am connected to something greater than myself. So the question becomes, are you listening to the loud voice of the ego, or are you tuning into the quiet wisdom of the true self? Because the more you rest in your true self, the more life flows with ease, compassion, and freedom. The difference in daily life. In our everyday lives, the line between ego and the true self is often subtle. Sometimes, we believe we're doing the right thing, but if we look deeper, the motivation comes from wanting to prove ourselves rather than from genuine care. This is exactly what the Buddha pointed out. All suffering arises from clinging to the self, holding too tightly to the ego. The ego always wants to make a mark, to be recognized and praised. For example, when we help someone but secretly expect them to be grateful or to compliment us, that act is still rooted in ego. Ego turns giving into an exchange. I give you something, and in return, I expect recognition. If that recognition doesn't come, we may feel disappointed, resentful, or even bitter. On the other hand, when we act from the true self, there's no need to prove anything. You help others not because you want to be seen as kind, but because you genuinely find joy in bringing happiness to another. Compassion flows naturally, without conditions. As the Buddha taught, loving kindness is already within us. It's like the moon that is always shining, only hidden when clouds of ego cover it. Take a simple example. You notice a coworker overwhelmed with tasks, so you step in to help. If your ego is in charge, you'll want acknowledgement, maybe even a public thank you. But if you act from the true self, the joy arises in the act itself. Whether they say thank you or not doesn't change the peace in your heart, because your happiness comes from giving, not from external validation. The same difference shows up in how we pursue success. Ego pushes us to achieve more so we can feel superior, so others will admire us. The true self, however, guides us to work wholeheartedly because we love what we do, because we want to create something meaningful for the greater good. Ego seeks the spotlight, while the true self seeks harmony and purpose. In Buddhism, this is the path of transformation, shifting from living in self, dominated by greed, anger, and delusion, to living in no self, where actions arise from wisdom and compassion. When we live from the true self, life feels lighter. We're no longer trapped in the exhausting chase for approval, nor are we imprisoned by praise or criticism. So the real question for each of us is, in my daily actions, am I acting from ego or from the deeper connection I share with all beings? Every small choice shapes the road we walk, whether it's the path of ego, filled with tension, or the path of the true self, filled with peace. Why the ego feels so real. One of the main reasons the ego feels so powerful is because it constantly feeds on memories and fears of the future. The ego doesn't live in the present. It lives in stories about what happened before and what might happen next. It whispers, "I was hurt once, so I must protect myself." Or, "If I don't control everything, I'll fail. I'll lose everything." Because of this, the ego creates an illusion of control. It convinces us, if I plan hard enough, if I hold on tightly, I will be safe. But life is always changing. No matter how much we try, no one can completely control the future. In Buddhism, this is called impermanence. Everything is in constant motion. Nothing stays fixed. The more we cling, the more suffering arises. The ego also creates an illusion of separation. It whispers, "I must protect myself. I am different from others. If someone else succeeds, it means I am less." This mindset traps us in endless comparison, competition, and insecurity. But when we look deeply, we see that separation is only an illusion. The Buddha taught that all beings are interconnected, like waves on the same ocean, unique in form, yet never separate from the whole. In daily life, the ego makes us overreact to small things. A single criticism from a colleague can keep us awake at night. Not because the words were truly important, but because the ego felt attacked. Or when someone else receives praise, the ego instantly whispers, "What about me?" This restlessness comes from identifying ourselves with mental images instead of connecting with our deeper truth. Buddhist practice offers another way. By returning to the breath and being fully present, we begin to see that the ego is nothing more than a stream of thoughts, constantly changing. It is not who we truly are. When a negative thought arises, we can simply observe it without attaching to it, and it will naturally dissolve, like clouds drifting across the open sky, never able to cover it forever. The ego feels real, but in truth, it is only a story the mind keeps repeating. A story built from memory, fear, and the desire to control. The more we believe in it, the further we drift from peace and compassion. But when we learn to see the ego clearly, we realize it is just an illusion, like a shadow on water. This is the heart of Buddhist practice, seeing through the false to return to the true. When we are no longer pulled by the weight of the past or the anxiety of the future, we discover freedom in the present moment. In that space, we no longer need to control everything or compete with anyone. We can simply live, breathe, and open our hearts to life as it is. The cost of living in ego. When we live through the ego, the price is often heavier than we realize. Ego constantly whispers, "I need to be more. I need to be better. I need to prove myself." This inner voice creates an invisible pressure that slowly drains our energy, showing up as stress, anxiety, and conflict in relationships. Think of a normal day. You're working, but in the back of your mind there's always a question. Am I good enough? Do others respect me? What if I fail? Even if you achieve success, the satisfaction doesn't last long. Inside, there's still a lingering emptiness. This is the endless state of never enough. In relationships, ego builds invisible walls. It demands, they should acknowledge me, they should love me in my way, they should prove my worth. But the more we demand, the more disappointment grows. Small misunderstandings turn into big conflicts because ego refuses to step back. A single criticism feels like an attack. and another person's success can trigger jealousy. Over time, love and connection are buried beneath comparison, suspicion, and blame. Buddhism points directly to this truth. The Buddha taught that the roots of suffering are craving, anger, and ignorance, all fueled by ego. Craving arises when we feel incomplete. Anger when the self is threatened. Ignorance when we cling to a me that doesn't truly exist. Living in ego is like being trapped in a prison without walls. Take a simple example. Someone believes they need more money to be happy. They work tirelessly, compare themselves to others, and when they finally reach one goal, it never feels enough. The cycle repeats endlessly, because ego doesn't know what contentment is. But when we loosen ego's grip, reality changes. Instead of working only to prove our value, we can work out of joy and contribution. Instead of envy at someone's success, we can feel genuine happiness and even learn from them. Instead of craving constant approval, we can rest in the quiet confidence of our own being. Buddhist wisdom reminds us, we are already whole in this present moment. We don't need to chase an idealized version of ourselves to be worthy. The real cost of living in ego is losing the natural peace that is already within us. When we return to the breath, noticing ego as nothing more than passing thoughts, we begin to taste freedom, ease, and a love that doesn't depend on conditions. Buddhist path to the true self. When people talk about finding themselves, they often think it means building a strong personality, proving their worth, or reaching a status that others will admire. But in Buddhism, the true self is not an image to project or a title to cling to. It is the natural state of clarity, compassion, and peace that already exists within us. Walking back to this true self is the Buddhist path, the way shown by the Buddha. This path has 3 essential gateways: mindfulness, compassion, and no self. 1. Mindfulness. Watching without identifying mindfulness is the foundation. Usually, we let thoughts carry us away like a rushing river, and we identify with them. I am this fear. I am that anger. I am the failure of my past. But practicing mindfulness is like sitting by the riverbank, simply watching the water flow. Thoughts come and go like clouds passing in the sky. They are not who we truly are. This clear awareness opens a quiet space within, where we are no longer trapped in worry or memory. In that stillness, we touch the true self. 2. Compassion, rising above self-centeredness. If mindfulness helps us see inward, compassion helps us open outward. The ego always wants to hold, to take, to prove. Compassion flows in the opposite direction. It gives, it softens, it connects. When we truly feel another's suffering, the tight grip of ego begins to loosen. The Buddha taught that nothing dissolves the ego more powerfully than genuine love. With unconditional compassion, we stop living in the cage of me and mine and become part of a larger, living whole. This too is a step closer to the true self. 3. No self. Realizing there is no fixed I. The deepest and most challenging gate is no self. Buddhism reveals that the I we hold on to is just a collection of memories, emotions, habits, and perceptions, constantly shifting, never permanent. When we see the truth of no self, clinging to wealth, fame, or recognition loses its grip. This doesn't mean we vanish. Rather, it means we are free to live more fully and lightly. No self is not emptiness. It is liberation. It dissolves the walls of separation and lets us rest in oneness with life. This path is not just a philosophy to think about. It is a living practice. Each sip of water taken mindfully, each moment of listening with compassion, each time we let go of a rigid belief because we see its impermanence. That is the Buddhist path unfolding here and now. The Buddha never asked us to become someone else. He showed that when the veil of ego and ignorance lifts, what remains is our natural clarity and freedom. The Buddhist path to the true self is not about finding something new. It is about returning home to what has always been within. As we reach the end of this reflection, let's pause for a moment and turn inward. Throughout life, we constantly hear 2 voices within us. One belongs to the ego, restless, demanding, and never satisfied. The other belongs to the true self, quiet, gentle, yet deeply powerful. The ego always whispers of separation. You are not enough. You must protect yourself. You must prove your worth. You must compete, defend, and guard your image. It creates invisible walls between you and others, turning love into comparison, connection into rivalry, and peace into a relentless chase for validation. The ego thrives on division, me versus you, gain versus loss, success versus failure. And yet, no matter how much we try to satisfy it, the ego never rests. But if you listen closely, beneath all the noise, there is another voice. A voice that does not shout, but always remains steady. This is the call of your true self, what in Buddhism we call the Buddha nature. It doesn't say you must become someone else. It simply says, you are already whole. You don't need to prove yourself. You were born to love, to connect, and to live freely. This is where mindfulness, Kaniyam, plays such a vital role. With mindfulness, you learn to watch your thoughts without becoming them. You notice when the ego speaks, and you gently return to presence, to stillness, compassion, to be, then opens your heart wider, reminding you that you are not alone, that your joy is connected with the joy of others, and your pain softens when you see the shared humanity in every being.
And finally, the Buddhist teaching of no self, Vo-nga, shows us that the fixed, rigid I we cling to is an illusion. Letting go of this illusion does not erase us. It frees us. It allows us to move lightly, without being bound by endless comparison and fear. In that freedom, love becomes effortless, peace becomes natural, and connection flows without resistance. So let me leave you with a question to carry into your day. The ego whispers separation, but your true self always calls for connection. Which voice will you follow today? If this reflection touched your heart, I invite you to continue walking this journey toward the true self with us. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss future teachings on Buddhist wisdom, mindfulness, and the path back to inner freedom. And if you feel inspired, I invite you to leave a simple comment. Namo Amitabha. Namo Adidafat. It may seem simple, but writing those words is like planting a seed of peace within yourself, and at the same time, offering that peace to anyone else who will read your comment. Remember, the path to the true self is not far away. It begins right here, right now. It begins with a single breath. It begins the moment you choose to listen not to the restless whisper of separation, but to the gentle call of connection. Perhaps that single choice, today, could transform the way you see yourself, the way you relate to others, and the way you live every moment forward. The ego will always try to pull you into division, but your true self waits patiently, calling you home to wholeness. The question is, which voice will you choose?